Welcome back. In this video, we'll be studying together Daniel chapter 5, verses 5 to 9. Now, in our last video, we studied Daniel 5, 1 to 4, in which the Babylonian king, Belshazzar, in an act of blasphemous sacrilege, defied the God of Israel by drinking wine from Yahweh's temple vessels, along with Belshazzar's women and his nobles, at a drunken party during which they praised the false idolatrous gods of Babylon. In Daniel 5, verses 5 and following, we see how God responds to this defiant challenge by this upstart king. We read, "Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak, and his knees were knocking." Now, John Goldingay describes Belshazzar's action here and God's response to it as follows. The presence of the temple vessels in Babylon is a reminder of something significant that had happened in recent political history. What he's saying is that, yes, the Babylonians had in fact defeated the Judeans, that's a matter of fact. But then he goes on to say that asserting the authority of Babylon and its gods over the exiles and their God succeeds in provoking the exiles' God to send Belshazzar a portent that only an exile can interpret for him. The reference to asserting the authority of Babylon and its gods over the exiles and their gods refers to Belshazzar's drinking from the sacred vessels from the temple of the God of Jerusalem. Goldingay continues. He says, "It will prove that the God who is treated as powerless has power, and it will expose the gods, these are the false Babylonian gods, who are manifestly powerless for what they are." And he quotes a number of passages that refer to gods who have eyes but cannot see, have ears but cannot hear, etc. And then he says it was a mad gesture, and the story hints that it would only have taken place under the influence of alcohol. So, in essence, Belshazzar misunderstands what the presence of Yahweh's temple vessels in Babylon really means, and he underestimates the God of Jerusalem, and he overestimates the false gods of Babylon. In fact, it's quite ironic that Belshazzar has the name Belshazzar. You see, Belshazzar's name means may Bel. Bel is Akkadian for Lord, referring to Marduk, who is the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon, and his name meant may Bel protect the king. In other words, it's a prayer that the Babylonian chief god would protect the king, Belshazzar, at this point. But we'll see that neither Bel or Marduk nor any of the other false gods of gold, silver, or other inferior materials that they were worshipping on the night of this banquet would be able to protect Belshazzar that night when Yahweh, the God of Israel, had decreed that his very life would be taken. So Belshazzar was messing with the wrong God in challenging Yahweh, and he was drunk in doing so. So God sends a human hand, which appears and writes on the plaster of the palace wall near the lampstand. It's writing there so that what is being written would be clearly visible. And the hand could be the hand of an angel, because angels quite often appear in human form. Notice it says that it was a human hand that was writing. Or the hand could be a theophany, that is a physical manifestation of the presence of God. But the fingers of the hand write on the wall, and this is quite similar to the fingers of God, which we're told wrote the tablets of the law in Exodus 31, verse 18. In any event, the point is that this is a message from God. The writing captures the king's attention. Belshazzar watches the hand as it wrote, and he seems to be spellbound and frightened. The blood drains from his face, as we would say, he blanches. His face turns pale, and we're told that he becomes so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. That's the NIV. Now, that phrase, his legs became weak, literally means that the knots or the joints of his loins, and loins would have referred to the midsection of his torso, the joints or the knots of his loins were loosed. Now, that's an idiomatic expression, and it could mean one of two things. Either the king involuntarily emptied his bladder or his colon out of fear. That's not a pretty image, and not the most common interpretation. Or secondly, it could mean that his hip joints and his upper legs went limp. This would be a symptom of extreme panic. That is, the king lost the strength to stand. And so the phrase could refer to the loosening of his joints, manifesting in a bodily collapse. And that's the more common translation or interpretation. But both readings are possible. Ultimately, what I think the expression tells us is that suddenly, at the height of Belshazzar's blasphemy, drunkenness, and immoral partying, the revelry ceased, and a deathly silence swept over the room. And Belshazzar and his guests quickly sobered up. Belshazzar moves from arrogant luxury to physical collapse and partial incapacity. The arrogant king, so full of bravado a few moments ago, is now reduced to a pathetic image of fear. So what does the king do in response to the writing on the wall? In verse 7, we read that the king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Now, the expression "the king summoned" literally in the Aramaic is he called with strength. That means he shouted loudly for these wise men. And he calls in the wise men, as Nebuchadnezzar did in Daniel 2 and 4, when that king was alarmed and afraid due to visions that God had given him. And like Nebuchadnezzar before him, Belshazzar seeks to use all the wealth and power and resources of Babylon that were at his disposal to fix the problem. And like with Nebuchadnezzar before, these efforts come up short. Now, in both of the previous stories in Daniel 2 and 4, the Babylonian wise men were unable to tell the king Nebuchadnezzar the meaning of his dreams. And so by now we can predict that in this instance, the wise men will also not be able to tell Belshazzar what is the meaning of the writing on the wall, which terrifies him. Like those earlier tales of court contest, Daniel 5 also serves to demonstrate the superiority of Daniel's God and the wisdom that he alone gives in comparison to the false gods and their false wisdom, and in comparison to the unhelpful wise men of Babylon. So in Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar had tried both to threaten and bribe the wise men to get answers, but to no avail. And here in Daniel 5, Belshazzar only relies on bribery. He doesn't bother to threaten, but he offers a reward. What does he promise? He says, well, anybody who can tell me what is the meaning of the writing on the wall, I'll give them purple clothes, I'll give them a gold chain, and I will make them the third highest ruler in the land. But the king is mistaken in thinking that wealth and worldly power can buy anything. Now, the purple garment that he promises actually points towards royalty. The purple is like a reddish purple. It's produced, the dye that is used to make the robe purple was produced by extracting it from murex snails. And this was an expensive and time-consuming venture. And because it was so expensive, it was largely limited to kings and those associated with kings. Rich people would have purple garments. And so purple was a color of royalty in the ancient Near East. Now, the gold chain would also indicate the authority of some sort. Like purple clothes, gold was limited to kings and those associated with them because of how costly it was to acquire it. And so it was something that was also used by Pharaoh, if you recall, in Genesis 41-42, to reward Joseph for interpreting his dream. The point is that both purple clothes and the gold chain are being used here as signs of respect and honor. This is what is being offered to the person who can read the writing on the wall. Now, the meaning of the third highest ruler would be a little unclear unless we remember the fact, thanks to all the extra biblical sources and the historical context work we did earlier, that Nabonidus and Belshazzar were number 1 and number 2 respectively on the Babylonian totem pole. And so the number 3 position is the next highest position on offer, and that's what's being offered to anyone who can read the writing on the wall. Well, we read next in verse 8. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. So as in Daniel 2 and 4, the wise men are unable to read the writing on the wall or to tell the king what it meant. Belshazzar comes up against the limits of the wisdom of his wise men and the limits of the wealth and power of his kingdom. Now, it's unclear why the writing could not be read or understood. One interesting suggestion is that no one but the king could see that there was writing on the wall. And so the wise men could not read it simply because it was revealed only to the king. And then it was also later revealed to Daniel. Now, this would make Daniel 5 a parallel situation to Nebuchadnezzar's dream being revealed to Daniel, but not to the other wise men in Daniel chapter 2. And it would explain perhaps why the king Belshazzar was terrified, but his nobles were only perplexed or baffled. That would be the case because the nobles could not see what the king was seeing. But if the writing was visible to everyone, and even if the writing was of Aramaic words, which both the Babylonians and the Hebrews would be able to understand, we do not know what type of script was used to write the words. And so another suggestion is that the text was written in Akkadian and or Sumerian, which are ancient languages. Akkadian is the ancient Babylonian language, but they were written in a cuneiform script, which is what Akkadian and Sumerian were written in. But then these words were given Aramaic meaning by Daniel when he interprets or reevaluates a text. In other words, he had to kind of decipher what the meaning was. So the point would be that the wise men would not be able to discern the writing because it was written in the script of one language that was used to write text in another language. That, I think, is perhaps a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. But from Daniel's later reading of the writing on the wall in verse 25, we learn that what was written were the words Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And from Daniel's interpretation of the meaning of these words in verses 26 to 28, it appears that these words were Aramaic. Now, Aramaic was well known in Babylon, so the wise men should have been able to read it. In fact, these three words, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin, would have been meaningful to readers of Hebrew and Aramaic, and they were not some kind of strange language as they kind of sound to us, modern readers who are not familiar with these languages. However, it has been suggested that the words were written in Hebrew or Aramaic consonants without vowels. Now, the Hebrew alphabet consists of 22 consonants without any vowels, vowel sounds are indicated by vowel points or markings that are placed under the consonants. In fact, only the consonants were written in ancient Aramaic and Hebrew scripts. And in fact, there were no Aramaic texts with vowels until the 4th to 7th centuries AD. So, what you're looking at there are the Aramaic text with the actual vowel pointings. So we have here the words with the consonants and the vowels. The little dots beneath the line are the vowel pointings to tell the reader what vowel sounds to use as you read the consonants. And so in Hebrew and Aramaic, you read from right to left, and you see the first two words look similar. That's mene, mene. And then the next word is tekel, and after that, uparsin. The u or u really is for and. And then, if you were to take away the vowel pointings, then what you'd have would just be a series of consonants. That's what you're looking at there. That is the words mene, mene, tekel, parsin with the consonant only without any vowel pointings. And so the first word, it's mem, that's our like equivalent to our English letter M, nun, equivalent to our English letter N, and then tet, equivalent, forgive me, and then aleph, which is a basically it's a non-guttural sound. I'm perhaps delving a little bit too much into the language. The point is that I wanted to make, if I could, is that if the words were written like you see there at the bottom with the consonant without the vowel pointings, it would be the equivalent of writing it in the Latin script that we use in the English alphabet, like that. The words without any vowels. Now, if words were written without vowel pointings, like written in English without any vowels, you'd have to guess what the meaning of the word is by trying to figure out what the vowels are. And being able to read a text of words without vowels partly depends on your understanding of the text. You have to know what words are supposed to be, what the words are supposed to be in order to fill in the vowels, and you have to know what the sentence is to be in order to identify the words. Now, the words also could have been written together without spaces, as was sometimes actually done. And it would kind of look like the equivalent of what you're looking at if you were to use our English alphabet in that way, just putting all the words together without vowels. And that would have made it even more difficult to decipher and understand, as if we were to put the English transliteration of the word together without any spaces, as you have there on the screen. So all I'm trying to do is to give you some possible suggestions as to why it would have been difficult to understand the meaning of the words. It's also been suggested that, as in Rembrandt's painting Belshazzar's Feast, the letters could have been written vertically from top to bottom instead of horizontally from right to left, as usually is the case in Hebrew and Aramaic. Now, the words were written vertically from left to right. I think I mean from right to left. They could not be read intelligibly if they were read horizontally. That is, if they were read sideways instead of reading them from up to down as would have been intended, with the words being arranged in a sequence that you're reading from right to left. One word, if you look, the first word would be mene, mene, then next tekel, then uparsin. Now, in any event, the real challenge, I think, was in determining the meaning or significance of the words. Seeing isolated words without a context would be extremely difficult to make sense of, as the readers would not be able to make sense of it because the words do not even form a complete sentence. But ultimately, the inability of the wise men to help or to read the writing or to tell the king what it meant starkly contrasts with the king's earlier brash, arrogant confidence and defiance of Israel's God. Belshazzar's confidence in Babylon's gods and its power suddenly comes up empty in the face of a forward message from Israel's God, which Belshazzar can't even read, and his revelry comes to a sudden end. The drunken feasting and blasphemy is replaced with fear and dismay. The king is terrified, and his nobles are baffled. And all this sets us up for the introduction of Daniel, as in the similar earlier tales of contest in Daniel 2 and 4, where Daniel enters the story only after the Babylonian wise men have tried and failed to solve the king's problem. And as in Daniel 2 and 4, the whole point of these contests in the story between this context in the story that contrasts the inability of Babylon's wise men and the ability of Daniel given to him by his God is to demonstrate the superiority of the God of Israel and the wisdom that he alone gives over the false gods and the false wisdom of Babylon. In our next video, we'll study Daniel 5:10-12, in which Daniel is introduced, moving the story forward. I hope you will join us then.